Why don't we tell kids where babies actually come from? I was scrolling on Facebook and there was something of a kerfluffle because someone had explained to her 4-year-old that babies are usually delivered via the vagina. It sparked an argument about when it's appropriate to give your kids the birds and the bees talk. The general consensus seemed to be the onset of puberty. However, I'm wondering why we don't just tell the curious 3 and 4-year-olds. Obviously I'm not a parent. But I don't understand why this information should be kept secret. Kids already know that some activities like driving are for adults only. So I don't think it would encourage them to explore their sexuality too early. And I know kids will spout whatever is top of mind, which could lead to some X-rated commentary with poor timing. But I feel like that can be addressed too. They don't need all the recreational details about sex. But the origin of life seems like basic information. Why is this kept secret until puberty makes it unavoidable? Facebook isn't a good place to get parenting advice generally. Most parents I know explain it pretty early on. Most kids with younger siblings have to be told as well. And kids talk to other kids. The idea that kids don't figure out where babies come from till puberty is unlikely. I found out in 8th grade health class. But I think my case was a bit on the extreme end of things. How early is early? My impression was that most people try and keep it secret from the younger 8 kids. 8th grade. You sure it was that late? I'm pretty sure everyone I knew had a rough understanding of how it worked by like 4th or 5th grade. Yeah. I remember sitting in class utterly mortified and wishing I was not in the front row, haha. But our situation was unique. My siblings and I went to a very small private school for a while before transitioning into private tutoring by a nun. My parents started divorcing and my mom couldn't upkeep the tutoring situation. So we were dropped into public school when I was in 8th grade. Thank God for sex ed. Even though it was mediocre at best. Oh. You went to them God schools, huh? That makes sense then. He probably found out when he was an adult that the earth isn't 5,000 years old. Life's crazy at those schools. The things I learned upon being dropped into public school were wild. It had never occurred to me that the earth could possibly be older than 6,000 years. That some people don't go to church at all and they're not automatically evil for it. And I could count the number of POC I knew on one hand. I thought racism was over after the Civil War. I didn't know it was normal for kids to listen to music for fun or pick their own clothing. And I had no concept of pop culture. We were extremely sheltered and the transition was brutal. Holy smokes. I didn't know it was this bad. It depends on a lot of factors. I have co-workers who send their kids to private schools and they seem entirely well adjusted. I think our situation was extreme. My kid's pediatrician told us to give them the basics very young before puberty. My daughter started her period at 9 years old. So it can be sooner than you think. Part of the reasoning is that kids that are properly educated about their body and how it works may be less likely to be targeted by predators. And they can explain what happened using proper terms if something inappropriate occurs. If a child calls her entire genital area her cookie and something inappropriate occurs, it's harder to collect testimony than when proper wording is used. He touched my cookie can be ambiguous. He touched my vagina isn't. Part of the reasoning is that kids that are properly educated about their body and how it works may be less likely to be targeted by predators. This is also extremely important, IMO. Knowing the extremely basic mechanics of sexual activity plus understanding that there is never an appropriate context for this behavior between children and adults seems really important. My mother was never given the talk. And to this day she remembers being terrified when her period started. Your pediatrician gave good advice. Because we're prudes. We have insulated ourselves from nature, and quacks convinced previous generations that any talk of reproduction would lead to promiscuity. If they're old enough to ask, they're old enough to hear with as many gory details as your discretion allows. I think it's because as a society we decided the topic was taboo. So it's been kept that way by the majority of the populace. It's slowly changing as people begin thinking on a similar line to you and the person on Facebook. I would believe that the taboo was heavily influenced by Christian beliefs as well, where anything that has to do with sex and private parts is a no-no. When I was a kid, my parents just told me that I grew up in my mother's belly, without details about how did that came to be and how was I taken out of it. As I recall, that was a satisfactory enough explanation for me at the time. Normal parents do talk about sex and birth with their kids from the time they're small. It is not normal to leave it until puberty. Small kids ask questions about everything. And when they're preschoolers and toddlers, someone around them is bound to be pregnant or have an infant, so they will ask. Puberty is far too late and a sign you're failing parenting. Imo. ETA. Up. Are you American? Because you guys are surprisingly backwards on a lot of things. Wow. The impression I was getting, and from personal experience, was that you wait to tell them until puberty is clearly on its way. I'm glad to hear that's not the case. Not in my family. I'm 44 and the norm when I was a kid was to tell them as young as possible. With age-appropriate language. Usually as soon as they started asking questions. That was how I and most of my friends were raised. And how I've raised my own kids. But then, some countries have weird ideas about sex and procreation. My childhood was extremely religious. So that is probably why my view is skewed. I had no idea. I'm glad I asked this question. And yes, I'm American. I don't know how many of us we encompasses, but in my lineage, we were instructed whenever we asked the question. In fact, that was my mother's general MO. Answer. Specifically and only the question they ask, and wait to see if there's another question. By the time we were in puberty ourselves, we had all the down low. Side story. One of my brothers is known for going back to 2nd grade and disabusing all his classmates of their faulty procreation beliefs in one playground seminar. That's what I do with my kid. 2. Kids are typically only looking for an answer to what they asked. They aren't asking for an entire rundown. If they're genuinely curious for more info, they will ask as long as you've shown them that it's okay to ask questions. As my daughter has gotten older, the level of info has expanded and she typically now asks follow-up questions. But we started at 3 when her auntie was pregnant with. Babies are made by a seed and an egg and have built from there. My kid is also adopted. So that foundation has served us well when discussing bio vs adopted relationships and why her cousin looks like grandma but my kid doesn't. I'm in Germany and we told our oldest when he was about 3 and my wife was pregnant again. We even have some children's books for the age range 3 to 5 that explain where babies come from and how they are made. My kids don't know how babies are made, but they know where they come from. My kids are all 2 years apart in age and the older 2 were both present for the younger sibling's birth. We lie to them about where humans came from. Generally God created them, so why not? Most normal parents do. I told mine. Following the rules of when they're old enough to ask. They're old enough to be told, and don't raise your kids with the problems your parents passed on to you. When you give it to them deadpan and express disapproval over any tittering, it actually seems to go fairly well. Because of the way I was raised, I was cringing inwardly. But I got over it. Who is we here? My parents told me, and I'll tell my kids. Explain it when your kid needs it. Usually before they learn it formally in school. Our schools had sex education starting in grade 5. When we would have been about 10. For your kid's sake, it's probably best they're not surprised by this. Otherwise, give them the talk when they need it. I remember when my parents gave me the talk, they also divulged that a family friend got it years ago because he was running around the playground yelling vagina a, and didn't understand the word. Only knew it was bad. He got the talk. And then understood why you shouldn't act that way. It also seems kind of messed up that we're taught anything related to sex is bad. I remember when I learned about it, I thought sex was a bad thing. I think it would make the mindset better not to impart that viewpoint.